The earliest known instance of cannabis use by humans was 2,500 years ago. Great to have you with us once more for another exciting episode of Plain English, the best podcast for learning English through current events. I'm Jeff. JR is the producer, and this is episode 166, which I'm sure you know by now means you can find the episode transcript at plainenglish.com/166, a full word-for-word transcript with interactive translations on the website, plainenglish.com/166. Coming up on today's episode, archaeologists have discovered the earliest confirmed instance of humans using marijuana for its mind-altering properties. It was 2,500 years ago and is thought to have been involved in a burial ritual. Later on in the program, I'll show you the two ways to use the English phrasal verb pin down, and we'll close with a quote of the week. Before we get started, if you like listening to podcasts, then you'll love listening to audiobooks. You can listen to books in English or in your own language. A great companion for those long commutes in your car or on a bus or however you get from place to place. For a free audiobook from Audible, visit plainenglish.com/book. It's quite the hot topic in public policy circles. Should marijuana use be legal? In fact, it's such a hot topic that we talked about it twice here on Plain English, back in episode 18, and then again in episode 98. Canada, Uruguay, and certain states here in the US have legalized it. Other countries like New Zealand and Mexico have been talking about it in recent years. But did you know that humans have been using cannabis for thousands of years? In fact, according to archaeologists, cannabis use has been around for over 2,500 years. That's the upshot from a new discovery high up in the Pamir Mountains in western China. A team of archaeologists, led by Meng Reng of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, has discovered the earliest evidence of cannabis use by humans. The team discovered 10 burnt offering bowls at the Jirzhankal Cemetery in western China. The bowls were wooden pots with stones on the inside and are thought to have been part of a burial ceremony, a funeral, basically, more than 2,500 years ago. The scientists believe that ancient people placed the cannabis leaves together with the hot stones and inhaled the smoke that resulted. When the archaeologists analyzed the bowls for residue, they were surprised to discover evidence of burned cannabis. I couldn't help but wonder how exactly they found cannabis on something that's thousands of years old. It turns out that there's a process, a scientific process called gas chromatography mass spectrometry. I was curious what exactly this means, So I went to Wikipedia and I didn't understand a single thing in the description. I did a little more digging, and I think I know what this is at a high level. They basically turn a sample, in this case the residue found on the offering bowls, they turn that into a vapor, a gas, and then they can mix it with other gases to isolate the exact chemical components of a substance. This is entirely over my head, but let's just say that they can take a small sample of residue and figure out the exact chemical contents of that residue. So this is not the first time that cannabis has been identified in the ancient world. Archaeologists have seen evidence of the cannabis plant in even earlier societies, but this is the earliest and most solid evidence of the use of cannabis for its mind-altering effects. So how do they know that these early humans used it for mind-altering effects like we use it today? Tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC for short, is the main hallucinogenic compound in cannabis. That's the chemical in the plant that causes the mind-altering effects in humans when we consume it. And the residue that the archaeologists found had higher levels of THC than what is typically found in wild-growing marijuana plants. There are two possible explanations. One is simply that the THC content of naturally growing cannabis plants was higher due to the altitude in the Pamir Mountains. The other, more interesting possibility is that people cultivated marijuana plants that had higher levels of THC and therefore greater psychoactive effects. Either way, there is a strong indication that early humans understood the psychoactive effects of cannabis and that they used it for that purpose. Marijuana consumption in the 5th century BC was quite a bit different from what it is now. Early humans, at least those in the mountainous regions of Central Asia, did not use pipes or joints to smoke dried marijuana leaves. Instead, scientists believe that smoking marijuana was done in a communal setting where the plants were burned in a central location and everyone would gather around to inhale the smoke together. They would do this on important occasions like burials or other religious ceremonies. The researchers also found musical instruments at the cemetery alongside the offering bowls. Scientists generally agree that cannabis originated in Central Asia, and they think that the plant was cultivated there, but it's hard to establish too much more from the existing evidence. How cannabis was consumed and whether early humans used the plant for its psychoactive effects is up for debate. For example, it could have been used as food or as medicine. It's very difficult to pin down exactly how it was used unless you have the kind of direct evidence that the researchers recently uncovered. The recent discovery tells us, then, that at least in this region, and at least at this time, people were burning cannabis leaves with high levels of THC as part of a ceremony. The interesting thing about this time and place is that trade routes across Europe and Asia were starting to open up. The so-called Silk Road connected Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Plants, animals, and valuable minerals were being traded between cultures and continents. So this could have been one of the ways that cannabis spread from its early home in Central Asia to the rest of the world. The amazing thing about this audience is that I know there are people who know what gas chromatography mass spectrometry is. By the way, can we just agree to call it GSMS from now on? Anyway, there are people who listen to plain English from all walks of life, including a lot of scientists. So I know there's at least a few people out there who are familiar with GSMS, which is just great. This episode is for you. The best audience in the world, someone once said, and that's exactly right. A couple of quick hellos to listeners. I got a note from what is probably the most exotic location of all the plain English listeners. Nisawu is from Togo originally, but now listening in the Ivory Coast, 2 countries in Western Africa. We get some listeners in Africa, but not nearly as many as from other parts of the world. So I wanted to recognize Nisawu for representing the great continent of Africa in our audience. And speaking of exotic, Alexander from the Maldives said hi last month. That's pretty exotic too. A couple more. Hello to Christian, who is from Brazil but living in Japan. Nadia from Rio de Janeiro. Pedro from Salvador, Brazil, and Moshe from Israel. I love hearing from listeners, especially your voice messages. It's a lot of fun to get to know you all that way, and I'll give you the WhatsApp number a little bit later in the show. Audiobooks are a great way to listen to English, and Audible has thousands and thousands of audiobooks in English and in other languages too. The Harry Potter books are a lot of fun. They're all on there. Business books, self-help books, and of course, fiction. If you've never tried an audiobook before, give it a shot. It's free with a 30-day free trial to Audible. Just go to plainenglish.com/book to get started. Audible is a subscription service, so you pay each month for access to one new audiobook a month. However, if you just want to try them out, the first month is free, and in that first month, you can download a book and keep it forever. Best of all, you can slow down the speed on the Audible app if you need to. plainenglish.com/book. Today I have a phrasal verb for you. It's a good one, but it's hard to explain, so we'll spend a little more time on it than usual. The phrasal verb is to pin down. I'm thinking of 2 different ways to use it. They're both related, but still different. Pin down. Okay, let's start with how you originally heard it. How did people live 2,500 years ago? It's difficult to know for sure. we have to rely on evidence and gradually piece together little bits of evidence and develop theories about how people lived. It's very hard to pin down exactly how people lived since we have very little direct evidence. It's hard to pin down. It's hard to know for sure. Before this recent discovery, there was evidence that the cannabis plant was around in Central Asia. But how was it used? Was it food, medicine? Did people really cultivate it, or did they just find it growing in the wild? It's hard to pin that down. It's confusing. It's vague. It's hard to know for sure. The good thing about this new discovery is that traces of THC were found on the inside of offering bowls that we know were used as part of a funeral. So although it's hard to pin down exactly how people used marijuana in those times, we now have some additional information. Here's another example. It can sometimes be hard to pin down exactly how a fire starts. We talked about the museum in Brazil and the cathedral in France that suffered devastating fires. Investigators will sift through the remnants of a fire, but in the early days, it can be hard to pin down exactly how the fire started. They have some pretty sophisticated techniques, and they can usually develop a theory, but oftentimes it is hard to pin down exactly how a fire starts. It can even be hard to determine whether a fire was accidental or not. So that's the first way you can use pin down, which is to find something out for sure, usually when there's a bit of confusion. The other way you can use pin down is to force someone to make a definitive statement. When did we talk about the Democrats running against Trump? Last Thursday, right? Some of them say they want a national health insurance program. Others say that a national insurance program is not a good idea. Still others, well, it's hard to pin them down. It's hard to get them to give you a definitive answer. They don't want to commit either way. They don't want to say yes. They don't want to say no. And when you ask them directly, they don't really give you a straight answer. It's hard to pin them down. Sometimes you try to be hard to pin down yourself. If you go to a job interview and the interviewer asks you, well, how much money are you making at your current job? You don't want to let the interviewer pin you down. You don't want to say the number if you can avoid it. Don't let them pin you down. Don't make the definitive statement, if at all possible. We talked about politics and elections on Thursday, so I wanted to make today's quote about that. It's from a former president of the U.S., Theodore Roosevelt. He was president from 1901 to 1909, so the beginning of the 20th century. Here's the quote. "A vote is like a rifle. Its usefulness depends upon the character of the user. its usefulness depends on the character of the user. That means it's a tool that can be used for good or for bad. A rifle and a vote both can be used for good or for bad, depending on the character of the person using it. Once more from Teddy Roosevelt, a vote is like a rifle. Its usefulness depends upon the character of the user. It's that time again, time to wrap up the episode. I promised to share some contact details. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are all the same, Plain English Pod. Send us a note on there. Leave a review, share us with your friends. We're getting better at the social media. We still have some work to do, but we are getting better. Plain English Pod. You can also connect on WhatsApp. The number is +1 312 967 8757. I've gotten a few requests lately. At least 4 people have requested another episode about an English-speaking city. I've got 2 in mind for the next one of these that we do, so I haven't forgotten about this. There's just too much to talk about every week. Anyway, I'll get you another city in the next few weeks. How about that? And that's it for today. Remember, Plain English Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Send us a message on there. And join us again for another episode on Thursday.